The United Nations says there are more than 6,000 indigenous languages spoken around the world, but it worries that 40% of those languages are in danger of disappearing altogether. And so the UN General Assembly declared this 2019 a year to celebrate indigenous languages. Yesterday, the CBC launched a website at originalvoices.ca to show how people are doing their best to preserve and revitalize their languages across this country. We have been wondering how Mi'kmaq is doing here in Mi'kma'ki. And so we invited Mi'kmaq linguist and elder Bernie Francis to the studio. Mr. Francis, Gwe.
Gwe.
Jalasi.
Well, Alin. Get a hamuk.
Is when someone does this, is this offensive? What I
Not at all. It's very, very nice that people are actually taking a crack at learning to speak the language. There are really no difficult sounds in the Mi'kmaq language. The only thing that might be different, which English doesn't have, is what's called a velar, better known as the guttural, which is the h. Arabic has it, for example, and even French has it.
Yes.
But that's the only sound that English doesn't have. The rest of the sounds are relatively easy.
And it's interesting too, because I was just doing a bit of studying before you were coming in, and looking at nouns that there are animate and inanimate nouns as well in the language, right?
That's true. In most Indo-European languages, such as French and Portuguese and Spanish, they have your masculine and your feminine nouns. Mi'kmaq doesn't have that. The nouns are divided into two groups. You have one group that are called animate nouns, and then you have the other group, which are inanimate nouns. So it can be, even the inanimate nouns can be sentient, or something that you might perceive as being somehow spirited or alive or something, It's not always easy to explain, but that's what it is.
Well, I think I saw a video with Curtis Michaels saying that a spoon is animate, but a fork is inanimate.
That's right.
So it's like the logic is...
That's exactly right. Yeah, sometimes it's difficult, but sometimes there's a certain distance you can carry that rule. Like, for example, a bus in Membertou is an inanimate object because it's we feel that it's because it's so close to the reserve that the city is close to Membertou that you could walk there, and bus is really not that important, whereas in Eskizoni, which is about 30 miles away, a bus is very, very important. Okay, so you can take that rule like that. But then you have a motorcycle, which is inanimate in Membertou, but animate in Eskizoni. So it begins to break down quickly.
So it's very localized too, huh? It's like the context of nouns and words.
Yes, I'd say that for the most part, it's pretty uniform. Let's say from Nova Scotia to New Brunswick to PEI, very, very uniform. We follow about the same rules, but from time to time, you will get people that will refer to something as being inanimate, let's say New Brunswick, inanimate in Nova Scotia.
Now, how many people are speaking Mi'kmaq now in Eastern Canada? Or I guess because some people in the Eastern United States might be speaking Mi'kmaq as well.
Yeah, I feel that the people in Eastern United States that speak Mi'kmaq are people that have moved there from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and so on. So let's say Eastern Canada, I suspect around maybe 8,000 or 9,000 people speak the language still.
And is that fluently speaking?
Yeah. Because I think maybe we might have a population of possibly around 30,000 maybe. But the language is really taking a beating. And this is where we complain heavily and try to make the education departments understand the importance of keeping our language. Our culture is what one would say inextricably intertwined with the language. So if we keep the language, we keep the culture.
And how are there communities where the language is more prevalent than others? Yeah,
it all depends on how close it is to perhaps a city. Membertou is, let's say, a little worse off than Eskizoni. Membertou is now surrounded by the city of Sydney. We're sort of in the middle now. In fact, we're a very high employer of the non-native, as Membertou is a very progressive place, and we hire non-natives to do a lot of the work.
Right.
Everybody in Membertou is working, or anybody that wants to work can work. In Eskizoni, they're 30 miles away, much more, isolated. There's no big city around it and so on. Therefore, you would expect that the language there is in better shape. I'm not saying it's in great shape because we still have, the internet and the television and so on that we have to deal with in order to, fend off extinction of the language. But that's just the way it is, and we have to take control of the technology and use it to our advantage to promote the Mi'kmaq language. And
how do you think, how is the language doing overall? How would you assess, I guess, the health of it?
It's not doing well. And I did hear someone on the radio the other day that did say that, the language is marvelous, the language is doing well. But that is not the case. We have a couple of schools, one in Kjipuktuk and one in Eskizoni, that are, classified as total immersion. But it seems to me that the English language is still used a lot in those situations. So that makes it quite tough to ensure that the children use the Mi'kmaq language for almost everything that they do. The Maoris did it. I spent time 1 month in New Zealand and spent time with the Maoris, checked out their schools, spoke with the teachers and so on. And they've done a wonderful job in resurrecting the language which was on its way out. And we also must follow some of their ways and what they've done to resurrect their language.
And what have they done?
First of all, the government didn't want to hear about it, didn't want to hear that the Maoris wanted to be educated in the Maori language. And when the people attempted to speak with the government to try to get them to change their minds, and they wouldn't, they decided that they were going to take matters into their own hands. So if there was a building, even a derelict building that was on the street, in one of the smaller streets, let's say in one of the villages in New Zealand, on the North Island, they would simply go and they would refurbish this entire building and then make a school out of it and bring in a fluent speaker of Maori and begin teaching the children in the Maori language. The second thing, of course, that had to be done was they had to develop curriculum materials in the Maori language, and they had to do it fast. Now, of course, it's understood, will be understood by anyone, that there are certain concepts which may not be found in Maori, such as things to do with maybe physics or mathematics and so on. That was interesting for me to check out, to see what they did. And all they did was they left a big enough margin on the side of the Maori books when they were talking about concepts that were not so clear in the Maori, or perhaps you couldn't even get them across. They would write them out in English on the right margin of that page. So it wasn't a great big obstacle, but they were quite sharp to be able to do it.
But that had been an argument, I guess, against Maori schools, was it? That, there's some concepts that you're not going to be able to teach with this language? Is that
right? That was one of them. And of course, they also knew that the best way to assimilate a group into the main society is to ensure that their language dies. Same thing happened in Mi'kmaq, and then that was about to happen in New Zealand as well.
We were talking before we came on mic here, before we turned the mics on, about Mi'kmaq in the context of other languages.
May I help you with that?
Absolutely,
word?
Yeah.
All right. The word I heard it said before by other people that you interviewed here who knew nothing about the language and never lived on a reserve. There's no such word as Mi'kmaq in the Mi'kmaq language.
Okay.
It's definitely Mi'kmaq.
Mi'kmaq.
That's better.
Mi'kmaq.
You got it perfectly.
I am making a note.
Good.
So Mi'kmaq.
Mi'kmaq, yeah.
Mi'kmaq is...
It's close to Mickey Mouse, but it's not Mickey Mouse.
Oh, no, don't. Don't do that to me. Don't do that to me.
I use that sometimes too.
Mi'kmaq is it's related to other languages, right? So...
It is.
Can you give us a bit of that context?
Sure.
The cultural or the linguistic context of Mi'kmaq.
Yeah. Well, you know that in this area, the people that are familiar with Mainstreet, or Linguistic, as they call it, there, and it's in New Brunswick, And there are several reserves. Fredericton is one, they call it St. Mary's, and then there's Oromocto, and there's Madawaska, and a few others like that. And Tobique is a big reserve. The Mi'kmaq language is a sister language to that. That's to the west. To the east of us, we have the Innu, which is the reserves there are Sheshashi and Natwashish, they're called. And then, of course, you may remember the one group, native group, that was wiped out completely, and they were Beothics.
Yes.
And we finally did enough research. In fact, it was done by Dr. John Hewson, another linguist from Memorial University. He's been there for 70 years or so. John Hewson finally was able to determine through his research that the Beothic language was also part of the Algonquin group of languages, in other words, related to Mi'kmaq.
Okay, I want to come back. We got to take a quick break for Rob Dublé to do some traffic, but I want to talk about what the state of the other Algonquin languages tell us about where Mi'kmaq could be going.
Right. Okay, well, easy enough to say that the Innu are starting to have some difficulties with children speaking English at too early of an age. That's, again, in Newfoundland, Labrador area. Then you have the Maliseet. In New Brunswick itself, there are, I think, about 60 fluent speakers left of the language. And that's a clear indication that it's dying, and it's dying fast. And then you have Maliseet, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot in the state of Maine. Those languages are not in greatest shape either, but everybody seems to be in a panic now, and they're working on them. But it's hard to know just exactly, how well they're going to be able to resurrect them.
Okay, we're going to take a quick look. We're talking with Mi'kmaq elder and linguist Bernie Francis, and we're going to have more of this conversation after a quick look at traffic with Rob Dublé.
This is CBC Public Broadcasting.
Thanks, Rob. I'm talking now with Bernie Francis, who is a Mi'kmaq linguist and an elder. We're talking about today, anyway, the state of the Mi'kmaq language. And we just left off before the traffic break talking about the health of other languages in the Algonquin group, the Innu, Maliseet, is that right?
Yeah, Maliseet.
Maliseet.
Yeah, or better known as Wolastoq.
Wolastoq. Okay,
yeah,
yes,
yeah.
that is the name that I know them by.
Yeah.
So you said, like, in the case of Wolastoq, there are 60 speakers now?
There are 60 speakers left in New Brunswick, and I was speaking to a lady who spent most of her life working hard to keep that language going. Her name is Andrea Bear-Nicholas, and I realized that it's not in good shape at all. It's actually quite sad when I meet with some of the Maliseets that come to some of the meetings that I attend to do with culture or language, that they're not speaking the language at all.
Huh.
So they're very, very worried and very disappointed at the slowness of programs, to teach the language. So it's not doing the greatest.
What does the health of these other languages tell you about the future of Mi'kmaq?
It tells us that we better not be sitting on our behinds, just waiting for someone to come along and say, I'll fix all your problems for you here, especially with the language, because it isn't going to happen. What has happened, in fact, is the governments and the churches, such as the Catholic and the Anglican and the United Churches, fought hard to ensure that the language disappeared completely. And as was said by Stephen Harper, the whole idea was to beat the Indian out of the Indian at that time. And sure enough, Shubenacadie Residential School was somewhat successful in doing that because people were punished for speaking the language, including my chief, Terry Paul from Member to Reserve, who was about maybe 4 or 5 years old when he was brought to the residential school. And when he spoke the language in front of the class on his first day, he took a swat with a pointer, I think it was, or one of those long rulers. And he couldn't understand why he was taking a beating, so he hollered out to the students and said, "Why is she hitting me?" It was a nun. And said, "Well, you're speaking your language. You're speaking Mi'kmaq. You're not supposed to speak it." So Terry, being 5 years old, not knowing the difference, he said, "Well, what shall I speak?" It was sad but funny And so that's what happened. They were discouraged. Fortunately, Terry managed to hold on to his language, but many of them did not.
And what that kind of, for however many generations went through that, through residential schools?
I think, if I remember correctly, it started around the 30s, very early 30s, I believe. And it went to, I think, around 66 or 67 before they shut it down. And I do remember Newell Doucette from, he was the first president of the Union of Nova Scotia Indians at the time, who was not pleased with the way our children were being treated. And, he fought to have that institution closed down, and he succeeded.
What does that do, that decades-long,
right,
concentrated effort to eradicate this language?
Well, first of all, it made the children feel that the language that they came into school with was of no value, that it served no purpose whatsoever. It's just it's been referred to as just a bush language. That's something that you would use in the forest or something like that, But it had no role to play in the education of the Mi'kmaq children. So that attitude it prevailed for a long, long time. And even my own people, let's say on the reservation, would say to me at the time when I was doing research on the orthography of the language, they would say to me, what's the point of teaching these kids our languages? They'll never get anywhere like that if they don't speak English. And of course, I told them, of course, they'll be speaking English. It's just that they should be speaking their own language as well. But no, they were already conditioned into believing that speaking the Mi'kmaq language would actually hold you back. That was the prevalent attitude then. And it took a long time to get people to begin to see that that's not the case at all.
Well, and you have made it your life's work to keep this language.
It's been for me, it's about 46 years, I think, I've been at it now. And we just lost one of my first students, as a matter of fact. She died this week, Saturday. Her name was Elizabeth Paul. She was one of my best and brightest, and I was very pleased to have taught her in 1980, so that's 40 years ago there. And she sort of continued on as a teacher herself. And in fact, she did so well that she was such a good teacher that when she finally got a job at the Cape Breton University, she was teaching Chinese students the Mi'kmaq language, and it was quite surprising that the Chinese students could actually pick it up rather well. So, so we have a lot of work to do.
Well, and we're really honored that you are here with us, and that you're going to be here with us over the next few weeks to talk more about the Mi'kmaq language, the culture.
Yeah.
For me, I personally am really looking forward to it.
Well, it's really an honor to be invited to do this, because I get all kinds of texts and emails and phone calls when someone talks about the Mi'kmaq language and purports to be a representative of the Mi'kmaq language and culture, when they haven't spent any time on the reserve or spent time with the elders. You see, I get the calls, and they upset me. I get upset because they're absolutely right. Mm-hmm. Except I just sometimes we feel we have no say, we have no power. But I'm hoping that we can be helping the people to understand the Mi'kmaq language better than they've ever had with these sessions that we're having now.
Well, thank you so much. Welaliik.
Oh, well, yeah.
Bernie Francis is a Mi'kmaq linguist and elder. And we're looking forward to chatting with him over the next few weeks.
This is CBC,